Thelwall in several essays, depicting Thelwall as the Jacobin fox who was hunted down by the government, while Wordsworth and Coleridge made a retreat and withdrawal from radical politics that Thompson both lamented and respected. It is likely that Thompson's treatment of the young Romantic radicals was shaped by his own political experiences in the 40s and 50s. Thompson tried to fashion a Romantic Marxism in his study of William Morris, whose Marxism is made to seem continuous with his romantic love of beauty and medieval art. And the first edition of his Morris study came out in '55 when he was a member of the Communist Party. The key mediating Romantic figure in the Morris study is Keats, whose aestheticism is implicitly antagonistic to the values of competitive capitalism. Thompson's Romantic hero was Blake, the witness against the beast, as he characterizes him, for his 1993 study. Building on the work of David Erdman, Thompson is wholly sympathetic to Blake's antinomian and radical Protestant prophecies against empire. Thompson's great historical study, The Making of the English Working Class, 1963, resonates with Romanticism in important ways. Perhaps the most characteristic chapter in all of Making is the ninth, The Weavers, the tragic story of skilled workers whose entire way of life was destroyed piece by piece. As Thompson writes, quote, "In the weaver's history, we have a paradigm case of the operation of a repressive and exploitative system upon a section of workers without trade union defenses. Government not only intervened actively against their political organizations and trade unions, it also inflicted upon the weavers the negative dogma of the freedom of capital as intransigently as it was to do upon the victims of the Irish famine." End quote. The weavers in Thompson's narrative have a voice by which they direct an intelligent and morally sensitive protest movement. As weavers and other skilled workers turn to Luddism, Thompson represents them with political intentions and a discriminating use of force. Ultimately, the weavers lose the battle to the free market forces, but the narrative has a morally meaningful context that judges the capitalists harshly. The underlying assumption is that moral judgments are meaningful and consequential. Moreover, the narrative highlights the agency of the workers, so that by the end of the story, the reader feels that the history could have been different. Things could have turned out otherwise. The historical world is not fatalistically determined. As in Walter Benjamin's On the Concept of History, Thompson's history refuses to accept as final the victories of the most powerful. He writes, "I am seeking to rescue the poor stockinger, the Luddite proper, the obsolete, in quotes, handloom weaver, the utopian artisan, and even the deluded follower of Joanna Suthka from the enormous condescension of posterity." Thompson does not want to neglect the blind alleys, the lost causes, and the losers of history. The parallels are obvious between Thompson's elegiac and commemorative narratives and Romantic texts like John Clare's Lament of Swarty Well, a wonderful, wonderful poem, and Wordsworth's The Ruined Cottage and Michael. Clare and Wordsworth, like Thompson's Luddites, protest against a capitalist logic that triumphs. William Morris's moral vision, according to Thompson, for Morris defines Romanticism as, quote, "the capacity for a true conception of history, a power of making the past part of the present." That definition has an emphatic making, a shaping of the past so that it opens toward the future and responds to the desire of the present. Thompson was not alone in developing the idea that Romanticism itself was connected in important ways with opposition to the abuses and injustices of a capitalist system. Robert Sayre and Michael Louvie, in numerous essays and several books, have developed their ideas about Romantic anti-capitalism. The title of their latest work expresses well their intellectual agenda, and it's translated as it's in French initially, but Romanticism Against the Tide of Modernity, 2002. They do not cover the same territory as Thompson, to be sure, and are more oriented to the continent than Britain, but their general idea is that Romanticism is a source of resistance to the modernizing logic of capitalism. David Simpson's most recent study of Wordsworth, 2009 it came out, reads the poetry as symptomatic of the reifying power of capitalist commodification, just the opposite emphasis in Sayre and Loewy. Romantic anti-capitalism is by no means monolithic, as it contains moderate tendencies, like the communitarianism and sentimental humanism one finds in the mainstream British labor movement from the early 19th century through much of the 20th, and a more militant utopianism at odds with modernity itself. Although Sayre and Loewy assign the most egregiously immoral political movements like fascism to what they call reactionary modernism rather than romanticism, there still seems to be a right-wing romanticism in the anti-modernist writings of someone like Carl Schmitt. Finally, to return to Wordsworth where we started, Lyrical Ballads Preface also protests against modernity, at least some of its features, such as a debased popular culture. Whether this protest is prescient social insight or an ideological self-serving maneuver depends on the critical tradition in which one is working. Okay? All right, so that's that.
Questions, comments?
When does the term plebeian poetry first occur?
Boy, I should know that.
I should too.
I don't know offhand.
I don't either.
But
But it crept into the discourse pretty early.
yeah, it definitely did. Yeah. On the other hand, I mean, later on it's contrasted with patrician, so plebeian patrician, but I don't think in the 18th century. Lisa, do you know plebeian when that? I don't either. I have to look it up. But it's a good question. Yes, Robert.
This is a sort of meta question, but you began by saying that when you looked at the MLA bibliography,
Oh,
you
yeah.
found these outsized proportions for the holy trinity of race, class, and gender,
Right.
with class being definitely underrepresented. But you didn't explain why you thought that was so, and whether there is a new attention, perhaps in the latter work that you summarized, to counterbalance it, and whether there is fruitful overlap or mixture of the critical terminology in any way. And that's one of the things that's kind of interesting about that tool, is that it doesn't show you the overlap.
Yeah.
But
Right. I think there is more attention to class, definitely, in the past 10 years around. Why was it, especially in the 80s and 90s, why was it so the other way? I think that's obvious. I mean, that it's it reflects academic literary studies culture. I mean, where you have feminism is such a important insurgent movement, so I mean that's going to claim a lot of attention, and why, and I think similarly the post-colonial, and also I think class gets dealt with, has been dealt with more in Britain than here. I think a lot more in Britain than here. And that's because of the weirdness of class, I think. I think it's the weirdness of class in the United States. It's just...
maybe with our sad economic fortunes that will change.
Class is an embarrassment in the United States, political, and I would include the academic left, as when you have so many conservative working class constituencies. And there's much more... there's less embarrassment in England where classes. It produced a political structure, the welfare state. So it's, but it has many manifestations. But with, anyway.